Okay, good morning. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I think after a good dosage of artificial intelligence, big data, and how neurons are behaving, from now on it's going to be a cinch, the discussion today. And I'd like to first thank the Indonesia Economic Forum for inviting me to be here. It's my second time to speak at the forum. Particular thanks to Shoaib, and I'm honored to be surrounded by prominent speakers such as Patrick, Ibu Dwi, and Kablan, and all the prominent guests and participants and stakeholders that are here at the Indonesia Economic Forum. I want to start with an anecdote that relates to artificial intelligence, and I'm not trying to pretend like I'm an expert on artificial intelligence. But a few months ago, I met with a guy who used to teach artificial intelligence at Stanford, and he decided to teach his stuff online. And when he did decide to do it online, he decided to get as many people as possible around the world to register for his class. And thinking that he was only going to get about 500 students, in a matter of 48 hours, he was able to get about 140,000 people to sign up. And he tested them, including the ones that he would have been teaching at Stanford on artificial intelligence. And what he discovered was that the 150 students that he would have been teaching at Stanford, none of them actually scored in the top 150 out of the 140,000 that actually registered for the class online. The point he's trying to make is that talent is actually universal, but opportunities are not. And the 140,000 students that he was teaching online included people that were dodging bullets in Afghanistan, people that were living in dire poverty in Africa, and people in financially destitute situations in Asia, and probably had about 4 or 5 hours of electricity in a day. But they were able to sign on and score better than those that would have been paying $100,000 per year for an education at a prominent university in the US. This anecdote got me to thinking about how the world has been changing and how the world is going to be changing. And as we know, the world is changing. It's changing for the better and also for the worse. It took thousands of years for the population of this planet to reach the first 1 billion. And it happened around the year 1800. Thousands of years. And the next billion, which is billion number 2, only took about 120 years in the early 1900s. And ever since the second billion of population on the planet, it's taken a much shorter time period for the incremental billion to be reached. And lately, we've gotten to over 7 billion people on this planet. And it took only about 13 years for the 7th billion to be reached. It tells you how fast the planet is changing, how fast the world is changing. It also tells you about how demand changes. Now, you take a guy in Kenya, he's eating a lot less than his friend in Kentucky. And the guy in Kentucky is probably eating at about 6 to 7 times the amount that his friend in Kenya is eating. So if we were to assume parity in terms of the consumption of food and drinks for everybody around the world has got to come up with 7 times the amount of food that some of our friends in the US are eating. It's a stark revelation. Now, is it possible for the world to come up with 7 times more food today as to be able to feed everybody equally at parity? Not easy. It's going to require innovation. We've also seen the shifts of paradigms. Ever since the World War II, we went through a stage of what we have called globalization. This was an era where economies from the developed countries were trying to promote better interconnectedness by way of trade and investment. Multinational companies were deploying capital as to promote not only economic activities in the less developed, but also to promote better connectivity. Then this era was followed by what we might have called regionalization, on the back of the rise of China, which became the tiger and the giant in the room. But as of late, we've seen what we call the era of nationalization, the era of economic nationalism. And the era of economic nationalism has actually been reflected in the way geopolitics and politics have been changing in the last decade. Not only in Asian countries, but more particularly in Europe and in the US. And there is no better explanation for this than what might have transpired a few days ago in the US. Now, a few years ago, when I was still in the government, I was asked the question as to whether or not Indonesia should participate in the Trans-Pacific Partnership discussion. At that time, the conversation was quite exciting. But I told my friends from around the world, it's really not just about promoting intellectual property. It's really not just about government procurement. It's really not just about getting moratorium for pharmaceuticals. But it's really about how anybody that's participatory in the discussion could ramp up the marginal productivity of the particular country. And the snapshot for Indonesia at that time was that Indonesia is running at a marginal productivity on a PPP adjusted basis of less than $20,000. And I shared this with you last year, meaning on average, people in Indonesia can only produce goods and services equivalent to about $20,000, vis-a-vis $50,000 in Malaysia, $120,000 in Singapore. So when you enter into a conversation, you got to make sure that, okay, there is differential capacities here, but we've got to find a framework within which these differential capacities should be addressed so that they move in the right direction. Unfortunately, that's where the sentence stopped. And that made it more difficult for us to engage in a longer conversation about some sort of a plurilateral framework on trade or economic cooperation. They thought I was crazy. But look what's happening now in Europe. Look what's happening in the US. It's right there in everybody's face. Why? Because the people in Mamuju, that's in West Sulawesi, by the way, and the people in Mankato, that's in Minnesota, by the way, they do not comprehend how globalization has been able to put food on the table for themselves, much less appreciate how globalization has been able to put food on the table for everybody in front of many of the suburban places around the world. Now, increasingly, multinational companies are also localizing their supply chain. 20 years ago, they would have probably tried to make the bolts in Hungary, the pistons in Indonesia, the wings in China. Now they go for where the big demand is. The big demand is in the US, the big demand is in China. Let's try to make everything in China. Let's try to make everything in the US. They want to localize the supply chain. That has explained for the tapering of the ratio of trade to GDP in the last 10 years. In some countries, there's even been a declination of the ratio of trade to the GDP. This is not just about economic nationalism, ladies and gentlemen. It's about efficiency. How do we integrate? How do we localize everything as much as possible? But it leaves us with an opportunity. As much as we're seeing fewer and fewer goods and services flowing between one place to another, physically, but there is a great opportunity for digital goods and services to flow between one place and another. That's where the opportunity is. Now, what's happened to the center? What's happened to centrality? If we take a look at the two events this year in Laos, where ASEAN, or the grouping of Southeast Asian countries, would have had to show centrality with respect to a number of issues. For example, the South China Sea situation. But it wasn't evident. It wasn't evident because we have moved away from the center. We have moved away from centrality. Why is that? Because as much as we would have liked to multilateralize our conversation, it's gotten very difficult. It's gotten almost to the point of being impossible, to the point where it is easier, it is more convenient to bilateralize a conversation. It's easier to talk with one person in this room than to talk with 400 people at the same time in this room. That's the reality of life. Because of that, or because of the increase of bilateralism, it's made it more difficult. Now, 30 to 40 years ago, the leaders of ASEAN would have had a lot more commonality. Commonality in the sense that they would have gone to the same college or high school together, or they would have had a common enemy, such as communism. They would have had a common enemy, such as poverty. They had a common interest that helped centralize themselves. Whereas now, the conversation is multi-pronged, much more bilateral, and almost every leader in this region didn't go to the same college with his counterpart or her counterpart. That has made it more difficult, and that makes it more challenging. The other trend is that when we talk about opportunities, of course we talk about risks, but when we talk about risks, we talk about risks in a vertical sense. We don't talk about risks in a longitudinal sense. We don't talk about what's happening in Jakarta and how it affects what's happening in Phnom Penh. We're not talking about how climate change is going to affect capital expenditure on infrastructure in Vietnam. We're not talking about deforestation in Kalimantan affecting how things are going to pan out in Laos, in Cambodia, in Thailand, or in Malaysia. And that's a problem. Because of the lack of conversations that involve horizontal nature or longitudinal nature, it lessens the capacity to innovate. I'm of the view that if you verticalize yourself, you can be innovative. But I do think if you horizontalize yourselves, you can be incrementally, marginally more innovative. And it does entail more centrality. It does entail more collectiveness for the purpose of stability and sustainability of the region. Talked about increase of bilateralism. Talked about the search for goods and services. When you want to deal with this big elephant in a bilateral conversation, you want to go after what they want. They want your goods and services, but you also want to go after what you can get from them, their goods and services. But here's the problem. If you are having a conversation with this other guy who has big demand, and you know in the other rooms within this hotel, there are neighbors of yours who are having the same kind of conversation with the same big guy, What's it going to boil down to? It's going to boil down to how relatively competitive you are, how relatively productive you are, how relatively efficient you are. That could make this room full, or half full, or empty. It goes back to that yardstick of being only able to display the marginal productivity on a PPP-adjusted basis of $20,000 worth of goods and services, vis-a-vis the 50,000, vis-a-vis the 120,000 of our neighbors. Where do you think the conversations of Malaysia and Singapore vis-a-vis the big demand are going to go? Vis-a-vis your own conversation with that same guy that has a big demand for your goods and services. It's self-explanatory. We've also seen the death of monetary policy. Since the Lehman crisis in 2008, there's been more than $8 trillion worth of liquidity being pumped into the system. $8 trillion by way of the quantitative easing being done by the US, Japan, European Union, and the UK government, and a little bit by China. Has that led to bigger demand for things? It hasn't, because we're not witnessing adequate amount of inflationary pressure, as a result of which we're not seeing the global economy moving in the kind of direction we would want.